Hi, everyone. This is Joe. Welcome back to the show. Before we begin the conversation, let me briefly introduce our guest. Laura Deming is the co founder and CEO of Cradle, a startup working towards human whole body reversible cryopreservation. She's also a venture capitalist focused on anti aging and life extension technologies. She founded the Longevity Fund. The Longevity Fund has since been superseded by a new fund called Age One. Laura is a co-founder and partner of that fund. And Laura was one of the very first Thiel fellows back in 2011. It was a real pleasure getting to chat with Laura at Cradle's office in San Francisco. We begin our conversation by diving right into questions of personal identity. If you're interested in learning more about personal identity, you could look up some of Derek Parfit's work. So with that, let's begin. Laura Deming,
Hi.
Welcome to the podcast. So I kind of want to do this conversation in reverse, so to speak. So I want to start by talking about the philosophical and sociopolitical implications of longevity, and then finish with some meta-science and the science of longevity and cryopreservation specifically. So to start with the philosophical implications of longevity. So say I reject the ego view of personal identity and I accept Derek Parfit's bundle theory. Each of us is just a web of experiences shifting through time. How should that affect how I think about longevity?
Yeah, so I think hmm, hmm. I mean, I'm like very obsessed with this question right now. It feels very core. I feel like not enough people are thinking about it, even though some people are thinking about it. I would say like where I'm at currently is that it's like very subjective, like that at the core of like the next century of what you might call transhumanism or like human interaction with technology is like just this question of what do you want to preserve over time? Like what's the thing that you care about? There's no right answer that I know of that anyone. I don't think either Eastern or Western philosophy have like some correct thing that you should try to be doing here that I know of. And so I think the question is like, yeah, what do you want to preserve? And you can actually make arguments for continuity. I think you can reconstruct reasons that you might care about, like physical continuity over time. But I think they're very different from like what you might be born with, which is kind of like this feeling of like need to survive, like need to like just make it to the next moment. Like that doesn't. I think that tends to not really. I think that becomes hard to defend unless you just want to pick it intuitively as a thing to hold on to, which you can also make the choice to do that.
How close are we to the point in which these debates actually start influencing like how capital is allocated?
Like today.
Seriously?
Yeah, 100%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that?
Well, I think the reason I'm really interested in them is I think that today, like, they're influencing how capital flows in a very subconscious way. Like, most people are born with certain beliefs around these topics that are not that well examined, and they're guiding kind of intuitions about what's correct and what's not correct to invest in today. And this is interesting because the investments today then determine what might be most available in the future, and that might then determine what a lot of people have access to. And so that, yeah, I think that is a strange, strange place to be in.
Right. And and which view do you think is winning at the moment, at least in Silicon Valley?
I think what I see personally, although it might be very biased, there's a lot of starting out with like what we're born to be most adapted to, which I think is like I just want my physical self to continue for as long as possible with physical continuity and like just like the most conservative possible perspective on like preserving yourself, like Ship of Theseus, kind of all the way.
Yeah.
And then I think when people really think about it, often there's like kind of a one-way door, or maybe it's a two-way door, but like this door you go through where it's like, oh, actually, like it's pretty hard to defend that. In Buddhism, this might be like analogous to doing like a no self meditation, just repeatedly, like and asking, what is the I? What is the I? What is the I? and kind of I think that actually I'm not like that knowledgeable, but I think in Buddhism, like when people just do this enough, like eventually they're kind of like, well, actually there's like maybe they come closer to the Derek Parfit view, which is interesting that both like types the philosophical traditions kind of get to a similar place.
Right.
But then I think you kind of should still be doing things to keep your body healthy and alive, and so you kind of have to reconstruct notions of like what's meaningful about that.
So I'm curious how your, I guess, emotional relation to longevity has evolved over the last, say, decade or so. So if I watch like videos of the young Laura Deming, feel there's this kind of like fiery zeal behind your motivation to drive the field forward. And I guess I'm curious whether or how that has changed.
Yeah, there's some stuff that I haven't written about publicly, but I'm planning to at some point that really shifted how I felt about that over time. I think I grew up with that as a really core part of my identity. I was like, my job is to fix this problem. No one else is or almost no one else is working on it. There's a field that's working on it that's very passionate about it, but it's not that well known. Everyone is very confused about this for some reason. Like there seems to be this mental block around working on this. And one thing that I've really understood, I think, as I've gotten older, is kind of the argument for the opposite of longevity and what's good there. I think it's still extremely incorrect to not work on longevity drugs, but I think there's a very real and very valid piece of wisdom in wanting to not think about this problem, which is like it can cause extreme mental anguish if you don't accept certain things in life that feel both to you horrific and inevitable. Like, let's say that I like spent every day like just really kind of grappling with metaphysical questions, like that might be a worse life experience for me than not, and like worse by significant margin. And I think there's like this way in which when I was younger, I didn't fully appreciate how much you should be, I think, respectful of some where someone's coming from metaphysically and their comfort when thinking about like like things like longevity. It's tough because you also like I think just factually it's incorrect not to work on longevity drugs. Like just in the sense of like they're if you believe in medicine, like they're just a type of medicine. Like there's I think that there's it's kind of like a an irrationality at the heart of viewing them as different in some very core way. Like they're kind of like just exercise or anything else that would like give you more healthy years. Like these drugs will do the same thing. But um, I think there's something that I didn't understand about like the deep wisdom of how to live a good life that I think it often drives a lot of like opposition to the idea of thinking about longevity as emotionally.
Mm. Is it? Can you share an example?
Um, I think there's this perspective that let's say I'm like I look at you and I'm like you're a human and you're like a really beautiful human and like your experience of the world like you experiencing the world in the perspective I think if you really relax your like sense of self or your experience of self there might be perspective of like your experience of the world is as valid like much more similarly valid to me as my experience of the world and so there's some sense of like just if all of humanity or like a lot of conscious entities are having like a good experience over time like this I think what I'm kind of dancing around is this idea is like it really depends if you get in the teleporter or not. So this like thought experiment of like there's a teleporter, it'll take you to Mars. If you get in it, the way that it does that is to create a copy of you on Mars and destroy the copy of you on Earth. Some people would get in the teleporter, some people wouldn't. I think if you would get in the teleporter, there's then a question of like what you care about preserving, which could be like your values, or it could be like very close to your current identity, or it could just be that people similar to you are still around and like that makes you happy. Like, and it feels similarly good to you that that's true, then like that you specifically would also be around. And I think in those worlds, sorry, this is like actually another reason why people might not be interested in longevity as like one conscious entity experiencing more time. But like in those worlds, you might feel equally happy that like, just the population at whole is still around. One counter argument though there is longevity allows you to have like conscious entities that have like a very long time to evolve. So they're around for a long time. And there's just a lot of beauty, I think, that you might see come out in that kind of conscious experience that you wouldn't with a much shortened lifespan, if that makes sense. So you can still even in that world have arguments for why populations might be a lot more interesting, or you might see different things with like much longer like times for specific conscious entities to evolve.
So I have some questions about transhumanism. So I know that lately you've been searching for a more humane transhumanism, and I'm curious what it is specifically about the core framing of transhumanism that you're trying to substitute for.
Um, I think there's a couple things, and I don't really understand this that well now, but I'm thinking about it a lot. Like, I think one thing is I think I just like went on a bunch of I was trying to understand at some point like what the transhumanist manifesto philosophy was, because I'd been adjacent to this movement for a long time and hadn't really understood it. So I went and read some stuff, and it just if you control F and search for like the word love in a lot of these like manifestos, like it's just not. I think David Pierce might mention this more in his work, but a lot of the stuff that I've read is very oriented around like gaining power and just like being really powerful and like this drive to survive. And I don't think that's bad or even necessarily like shouldn't be part of the future, but it feels pretty incomplete. Like it doesn't feel inspiring to me personally, or like I don't know. There's something there that and it also feels, and so that's one part. And the other part is it feels way too confident in the types of technologies and the types of ways that things could change. And I think the more that I think about this stuff, the more it's interesting to me to see populations change in ways that are hard to predict versus kind of like individuals change in ways that are easy to predict. And so that feels like I'm interested in versions of transhumanism that are more oriented towards the former and like kind of less centered around the latter, if that makes sense.
So the core framing thinks it's far too focused on the individual as sort of the unit of analysis.
I'm not sure. Like I think the thing that I know for sure is that like this is not there's some version of this that we just have no idea what it even looks like yet.
Mm.
And I think the things that like the individual versus population view, or like the like determined versus like emergent view, are two axes where it feels like there's some push and pull, but yeah, it almost feels like in my head it's like reseeding from a totally different point in phase space or something. Or there's just like notions of like one interesting fact is that like a lot of sci-fi authors, I think, intentionally don't write futures that have quality very different from our own, because that's very hard to relate to. And so their books would be like very not popular. Like Greg Egan mentions this. He's kind of like past a certain, who's one of the most like futuristic authors ever. He's like past a certain point, I was just like, I can't write narratives that are more than a given amount of sci-fi with regards to quality, because I just no one will read like it. No one will relate to this book. You need to have characters that are relatable, and yet there's something about that also feels related to this kind of lack of, I think, really really new visions for like what kind of what we would call transhumanism looks like, I think.
Yeah, on that, have you found any literature that does a satisfactory job of capturing a more humane transhumanist vision?
Um, I- Not that I really deeply. I think yes, but like maybe the thing that for me does this right now, and I think would make no sense to like most people, is just like Rilke's Duino elegies, which I don't understand at all. Like I like understand 0.0005% of these poems, but I think they are trying to say something about something that feels relevant to this, that feels interesting to me.
That's it. I haven't read them, but can you describe it?
So there are these poems that they like deal. They're kind of. I'm trying to remember the opening line. I think it's something like if I cried out, "Who among like the heavenly order would hear me?" or something like this, and kind of the it's I mean, it's almost impossible for me to begin to just understand personally or even describe like what they're about, but it's about kind of an individual in some sense trying to connect with something that feels on a different level, I think, of what you might call understanding or experience that they only see very dimly. Like they now, I think that a theme that often comes up in the poem is like angels, not in a even like Christian religious or any specific kind of religious sense, but just as a like metaphor for something that is very dimly felt. And this feels really interesting to me as like an analogy for us as humans trying to kind of I think the interesting thing about the idea of transhumanism or like a related concept like transcendence is just like that you're trying to become something that you don't understand. It's like flatline, like Edwin Abbott,
Mm.
like you're like a little 2D thing and you're trying to like become a 3D object, but you can't even conceive of what that 3D object is in your current 2D form. And that to me is the most interesting right now, like part of transhumanism is like that act and what it means to like try and do that.
Right.
Um,
I was trying to think about this question last night myself about whether there's any good humane transhumanist literature. I couldn't really think of any examples. I thought maybe The Gentle Seduction, the short story by Mark Stigler.
yeah, so it's really interesting that you I was like, damn, one of the most interesting sets of questions. Yeah, a colleague of mine, Kat, like showed me this story, and it's amazing. And I think for a certain, in a certain, I think that sense of like the way that our company thinks about technology feel like is something that you know, she's been thinking about a lot, and feels really interesting to, for like the company that I run and with my co-founder. But I think for me personally, it's a bit of a different flavor of like I think even in the story, like the types of technologies they're talking about, it's like it's so relatable to our current human experience. It kind of avoids the whole question of how strange the change actually will be. It just says that you should do it gently, which I might like maybe the thing I could go on with the story is that like probably it's good to care about how people feel while you're making like changes
Mm,
to like what we would call the human experience over time.
mm,
Like that makes sense.
right. I think that actually provides a good segue into like the next thing I wanted to talk about, which was this kind of sort of socio-political implications of longevity. Because before we started recording, we were chatting about Francis Fukuyama's takes on transhumanism. So assume that we do achieve substantial advancements in longevity science and average human lifespans and health spans are, I don't know, say 150 to 200 years or any kind of average length that you think is most interesting to discuss. What are some of the most non-obvious ways that that changes human society?
So I've tried to think about this in a really principled way, and like I am not an like there's I think my current state of understanding is that like I probably don't even know the largest and most important things to consider. But there are some things that I found interesting to think about.
Right.
But I would say like you know, there might be somebody who spent 10 years thinking about just this question, not even the technical parts of longevity, that would like answer it far better than I would. Um, I think for me, the thing that I'm most passionate about is actually, I don't know if you ever heard of this painting called The Great Wave of Kanagawa, off of Kanagawa. It's one of the most famous paintings of all time. You know, if you see the like wave
Yeah.
in the Ushio
The
style thing.
tsunami.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's actually fascinating. Once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. I think Wikipedia said it was the most memed like
Hmm.
image ever, like maybe
Mm.
even more than the Mona Lisa. I'm not really sure about that claim, but like it is everywhere. Like I see it on the street walking down like Valencia Street in San Francisco,
Right.
all over on people's laptops. Like
Yeah.
there's like probably two people in the office who have like this on their laptops,
Mm.
just for some reason, right? And the painter of that work was I forget exactly how old, but I think he was 60 or 70 when he made it. And he has this incredible quote where he says that he feels at the end of his life as though he's only just begun to learn how to draw, like, you
Mm.
know, a line or an animal. And he's like, maybe when I reach the age of, I might be misquoting a little bit, but like maybe when I reach the age of 100, I'll be able to draw things which are truly alive for every line, every point, you know, has its own. And then he died, you know, a little bit after giving that quote. It's just this idea that, look, this one of the most incredible works of art that is persistent in this, even this very competitive and magnetic environment. This work of art just shows up everywhere. It's got this depth to it. It's got this originality, and it's created by somebody who spent their whole life preparing to do this one thing. I think it kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier with this idea of what do we care about with regards to self. Like it's, I think, an interesting um, idea around what, like, why you might want a conscious entity to live a long time. It's just like, what could happen if you have this kind of evolution over a long period of time of conscious entity that you might not be able to install deterministically if you just kind of like instantiate something, from scratch. It might be very hard to get to that same point of evolution for a certain kind of process. And so I think that to me is just beautiful as an idea of like, what could we see, that we've never seen before. And especially if you can give those minds kind of fluidity and longevity. And this is not talking about minds that are aging to the point where they then become unhealthy. It's talking about keeping minds creative and fresh and kind of changing and finding ways to do that. Like that feels so interesting. I think another thing that feels really interesting to me is this idea of in game theory of, often if you have a single round game where you have two agents playing with each other, they will, it's in your interest to affect and hurt the other person. But if you have, let's say, either a very long number of rounds, or I think that if I remember correctly, which could be incorrect, it's that you don't know how many rounds you're playing with the other person. I think that's the point at which it becomes advantageous for you to cooperate. And so, yeah, one thing I'm really interested in, although I think there's lots of reasons why this might not be true, but just one constant I'm fascinated by is this idea that if you have so much time and unknown amounts of very long periods of time in society, how might your behavior be different? There might be some bad ways where you might be more conservative or other things, but there might be ways in which you are incentivized to be like a lot more pro-social. Although, that's just a thing that I'm fascinated by. I don't know that I can like defend that empirically with current human. I think there's lots of reasons why that might not be true, but I think that's like a fascinating, the game theory of what society looks like is very interesting. On the negative side, I think one of the strongest things that I've been able to think of personally that is true about longevity is that it could mean if you have a lot of capital at the start of, if you're, let's say, the first generation that lives like a very, very, very long time, but then you have just like this insane advantage of like youth is no longer this advantage that it was. And instead just like being born way earlier as a form of inequality where you get like much more time to compound capital. And you can still argue that like maybe you need innovation. And so if you don't innovate, and just stay where you were, that like whoever does innovate will be able to take you over. And so that there's some reasons why this might not be so bad. But I think that there might be different ways that you'd want to structure society or like tax wealth over time that would come more into play in that world. And then that feels like a real thing, that way that society would change that might be tough.
On the first idea, it's interesting to apply this to scientists and to wonder what would have happened, say, if we had Einstein for like an extra 50 or so years.
Yeah, an important thing is not just Einstein, but I have a friend. I need to fully understand if this is correct, but my understanding is that Einstein had a period in the middle of his life where he got quite sick, and then became much less productive during and after that period. And so not just lifespan, but also I think feeling robust, vigorous, feeling like a lot of health and a lot of plasticity. Like those are important concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. Because obviously, things as simple as your energy levels make such a great difference to your ability to do great work. So I wonder like what the other sort of dependencies or assumptions are here. So another kind of notable thing about Einstein is that, some people at least, I think like, so in the James Gleick biography of Feynman, I think he talks about how Feynman and Freeman Dyson thought that Einstein sort of lost his creative powers at the point at which he stopped thinking in like concrete physical images. Is that like, I wonder how much that kind of like stultification in thinking is linked to the aging process, or if it's just like a generational thing, or if it's just some kind of other contingent factor. Like, so if we did, I mean, obviously there are other things that affect a scientist's productivity than just their vigor. But if we did have Einstein for an extra 50 or so years, I wonder whether he would have been able to achieve that level of productivity that he had during, for example, like the Annus Mirabilis.
Yeah, so this takes you back to a question that we started with, which I will just keep it. I think it is the core, which is like, what do you want to preserve over time?
Right.
And there's this question of like, if a lot of people like you might see in their life that, let's say they go through a divorce, or they have some huge loss of faith or some big like realization and change.
Mm.
I think there's this process that happens, which I might characterize as like, I don't know if you know like the hero's journey, but kind of like
Mhm.
this. I often think about it, and this might be incorrect, but personally for me, it's like a very helpful analogy for identity change or personality change, where like you go through this kind of like dark subconscious process and then come back out on the other side a different, like changed in some deep way. And I think in my head, when I see hero's journey stories, they often feel personally to me very much like they're describing subconscious experience of personality change or identity change. And so I think the question is like, maybe if Einstein wanted to be the kid that he was when he was, I forgot how old, 27, 28, during last Maybe maybe a lot earlier if he was 23, then like, goddamn. But if Einstein was like, I want to preserve as much of that person as possible, perhaps it would have been difficult. But let's say that Einstein had some openness to changing him parts of his identity, as many of us do, and he had some ideas of what principles he wanted to guide that change. Like, I think that's kind of where you would expect there to be more of a potential for continued like relevance.
Mm. Hmm. So one of the concerns that Fukuyama raises in his book with respect to, so there's a chapter on longevity. One of his observations is that our worldviews are shaped by our formative experiences, often the formative experiences we have in our youth. And there's like a generational effect here where so people growing up in the Great Depression or the Second World War will share, or the sexual revolution will kind of share a set of youthful experiences that like quite durably affect their worldview. And that's why you often see in kind of like social and political dimensions these sort of like revolutions or changes where we go from like one generation to the next, so from like the Kennedy years to the Reagan years, for example, or to or from like the sort of New Deal era. So if we were able to massively extend human lifespans and health spans, I mean, presumably those sort of like generational effects wouldn't change. One question you might have is whether then that leads to a somehow like less dynamic society, if there's like less turnover in certain positions because people were able to live and work for longer, but they're still affected by those, they still have that generationally inflected worldview, whether that somehow produces like a society that's less dynamic.
I think there's like a lot of, I think there's like with a lot of, I think rebuttals to, or like ideas that like are kind of not counter longevity, but kind of like here reasons why it might be bad. It's like, yes, I could definitely construct a version of society where longevity might be bad. Like one in which everyone joined a company, had a job, and then never left that job, no matter kind of, how their beliefs might be relevant or not. And there was no change in the society, like, and no way in which like holding on to beliefs from the past that were no longer relevant today affected your like position in the society. Like, sure, like maybe I could construct a society where like this would be like a problem. But I don't think we live in that society even today. Like, I think if you look at a lot of artists, right? Like, like I love Linkin Park growing up, and like they're still huge. Like we still love Linkin Park. Like they're still huge, but they're not necessarily like the dominant sound the same way they were when I was growing up in the 2000s, right? And that's not necessarily because like they didn't. They kept making music. Actually, a lot of their work I think is like a little bit similar to, or it has some vibe to. They started out with. There's some argument about how much they deviated, but it's like they were replaced by different styles because people like different styles of music, and those became like more dominant because the culture shifted, and like that's what people responded to. So I don't know. I think Francis is a point, but I don't even know if we live in society right now that point would be the strongest, and if that makes sense.
I see. Yeah. So I want to talk about some meta scientific questions now. One of the themes that just juts out to me in your online writings is the importance of the emotions of joy and awe in science and scientific discovery. Is it possible to train the ability to feel scientific awe?
Uh, I sure as hell hope so. Like, it'd be really sad if not. Uh, mm, yeah, I really, I really, I really hope it is, and I don't know if it is. Yeah,
For people who are capable of feeling it, do you know whether it's possible to have it on demand? So,
yeah. For me at least. Yeah,
oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so for me, sometimes I'll have like feelings of scientific awe. Maybe it's like it could be something incredibly cringe, like I don't know, I'm looking up at the stars or something, and I just have that moment of like, what's this all about? I really hope I live to see the answer to sort of what we're doing here. And then so I have that feeling of awe. And then maybe I won't have it again for 6 to 9 months. And I have it again. And two things happen. One is, well, the first thing is that I have the feeling. The second thing is that I notice or I remember, like, oh, that's that feeling. I'd kind of like forgotten what it was like to feel that, almost in a similar way that when the seasons change, like when you're in winter, you kind of forget what it was like to be warm. And then when you're in the summer, you kind of forget what it was like to be cold. And I haven't I haven't been able to conjure it on demand by just like, okay, the next day, let me try and have the same thoughts and like recover that same feeling. It feels like you sort of like lose sensitivity to it or something. So
yeah,
I'm curious that you might be able to conjure it. And I was hoping you could, yeah, share more about that.
yeah. I have spent an enormous number of hours thinking about
Oh,
this.
really?
Yeah, there was a point in 2018 or 2019 where I had this experience of my friends were out of town for the weekend. I was alone by myself in our house, and I just had this like intense like absorption into an evolution question that I was thinking about. And I just got really into it. And I remember feeling like, oh, I can see the universe. I can see like what you might call your conception of God, or like my personal feeling of just seeing, being one with the universe. And I was so excited by it. I was like, I can't forget. And so the thing that I did, which, honestly, I'm terrified might be like really bad for my personal health, but I wrote on my hand a number, and it was a number of hours that I wanted to be in that state of just intense awe and absorption. And then every couple of days when it rubbed off, I would rewrite the number on my hand so that I would remember. Like it was like the most personal kind of tattoo you could imagine of like trying to remember, like to be connected with this. And I've spent a lot of time iterating on different things. I actually have a page on my website that goes through the things that work for me to get into the state. So for me personally, it's really important to be in some kind of grassy, open environment, to have music playing, to have eaten sugar recently, to have some kind of set of mental objects that are developed enough that they feel like you can interact with them in the state. Like I think cell biology is very, very good for this. But I think if you read Einstein's work and a lot about his early education in high school, I think there's actually this whole tradition in like mathematics that Einstein was also exposed to of high school teachers who would ask their students to do very visceral things. Like I think I read about a math teacher who was like telling his students to like hold apples in one hand and like, some amount in one hand, some amount in the other, and then get an intuitive sense for quantity that way, and then
Mm.
use that kind of somatic intuitive sense in their thinking. And I think Einstein's high school had some kind of tie to this kind of visceral or kind of they had some very specific philosophy of education that was related to this. And yeah, so for me, there's just a set of things that work to get into the state, but also there's a lot of preparation, I think, intellectually to get objects that actually you can then manipulate once you're there.
Would it be fair to say that that is the emotion you optimize for in
Yeah,
life?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. How many like I don't want to kind of like kill the vibe by trying to quantify it too much, but like how many, I don't know, how many like hours per week or per month do you think you would spend in that state?
So 512 hours since 2018.
Wait, what? That's amazing.
Yeah.
Um, wow. When you think about the role of scientific awe in doing science, would you characterize it more as a kind of behavioral thing where it's just like an important way of helping you maintain motivation and persevere at very difficult long-term projects? Or would you characterize the importance as more about helping you actually achieve better insights in the short term by putting you in a state where you're somehow more creative?
What was the first thing again?
I guess the first thing was more of like a behavioral thing where if you're experiencing this pleasant emotion, maybe you just like stick at a difficult project for longer. And then so that's like indirectly better for doing science. But there's nothing about the state itself which in the moment makes you more creative than normal.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think honestly, I struggle with this enormously. Like, I think when I first encountered the state, I was like, this is everything. Like, this is the state. You should be in the state all the time. Like, and I do optimize like most of my life around being in the state. And at the same time, over time, it was like, yeah, like a lot of great scientists probably aren't in that state ever. Like, it's not clear that being in that state solves all your problems. Like, for a lot of shitty work that you might, or well, for a lot of work that might be like, it's not clear the state actually. I don't know how much being in that. I think a little bit is certainly very, very good, but I don't know how much being in that state is going to like make you more likely to win a Nobel Prize or something. Probably most people who have won a Nobel Prize have been in that kind of state at some point, I would guess. But it's been hard. But honestly, over time, it's just like give I don't care at all how much I think part of the state does feel that it's tied to some idea of truth or something. Like, and I think that feels important to me. Like the idea that like being in this kind of state, like it's interesting. I've had a lot of experiences that are like more, I don't know if non-dual, but it's correct, or I don't know if I've ever experienced that, but just like more meditative, let's say, where it's like, oh, I feel great, or I feel like some kind of calm, or I feel like peace. And this feels different than that. I've always been confused about the difference between these two. This feels much more like there's some laws of the universe that are real, and I get to talk to them, and they like me, or something. They want to talk and they want to hang out,
Mhm.
and I think I just like the state for itself. I don't like it for any functional reason.
I see. It's sort of
Yeah,
like a hedonistic thing.
totally. Yeah, 100%.
That's awesome. And so it sounds like quite a spiritual experience.
Yeah, like I think I've at some point reading descriptions of people having like intense religious experiences, I was like, oh, like I'm just for some reason my brain is wired so that I experience something that sounds like what they're describing, but in response to like reading a physics textbook,
Right,
like,
right.
yeah.
um, can you recall any recent moments or insights you've had that triggered that state that you'd be happy to share?
Yeah, I mean, one that always gets me there, or I don't want to jinx, but like normally is just this idea of thank you, this idea of like a being in a cell. So like if I just
Mhm.
I think when I was, yeah, just there's this exercise you can do called Powers of 10. I have a video about it that I did a while ago that's like super jank, but it is the thing that first was helpful, which is like, maybe you can probably imagine a cell. It's like you have some idea of a circle and like there's some stuff in it. And it's kind of like, but there's a thing you can do where, did you ever as a kid have the experience of going into an imaginary world where like you construct an imaginary world and you feel like you are actually there? Like, have you ever had that?
Mhm.
So, like, imagine combining those two things where you have enough, let's say you've read enough about the cell, you've seen enough pictures that you kind of have some sense, and you know some of like what might be true of the laws, which is the really interesting part. And then you can connect the feeling of being in an imaginary world with being in a cell, and you can use your brain to track the kinds of laws that are true in a cell such that the world that it's generating actually corresponds to reality in some very deep way. Like it's pushing, like you push the world and it pushes back at you in a way that reflects what the cell would actually do. And so you can explore around and actually find out stuff. Like that's magic. And I think a lot of physics law experiments have that kind of flavor, if I like potentially.
Yeah. So like one thing embedded in that is you need a very robust understanding of the actual laws that govern, for example, molecular biology, right? So you need to have all of that scientific understanding at your fingertips.
I think you need to have I would think about it like you need to have enough to render a world that has some like maybe that has enough. I have someone I worked with for math education who had this really interesting concept of of toys in mathematics. Like you give someone a toy and they kind of like poke it and push it, and it needs to have at least as much complexity as, like, let's say a math problem, like a simple math problem that has, some stuff where you can poke the math problem and it'll push back in ways that, like, it's telling you something. The world needs to have at least a little bit of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any ones we could do right now? Like, could we do a guided visualization? Maybe it won't work for that reason, because I need to be able to render it properly in my mind. Maybe we could do one which conveys a sense of like the logarithmic scale.
Maybe. I'm a lot. It's not where my brain is right now, but one thing you can do is the thing called powers of 10, which is like basically imagine like your arm in front of you, and then you like hold that mentally, and then you imagine your hand, and then you imagine expanding your hand so it's the size of your arm.
Mm-hmm.
And you just like do that, and you see this large hand is in front of you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you put your thumb out next to your hand.
Do I have to physically do it?
If you can imagine it visually, internally, that's great too. And then you expand out your thumb so it's now as big as your hand.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, I forget the exact progression, but if you do this down like 8 more steps, you get down to an atom.
Mm.
And, it's like eventually you get down to like a mammalian cell, and then a fibroblast, and then might have been a virus next, and then maybe a protein after that, although I might be getting this a little bit confused now. It's been a while. And then, the last step is an atom, which is about 10 to the minus 10 meters across. And you realize that you're just 10 steps away logarithmically from an atom. And then you have this kind of ladder where whatever visualization you're doing, you can kind of move up and down the ladder to the correct scale and see what's happening there, and then leave it there and then go to a different part of the scale and see what's happening there. But like everything is short. You don't have to say goodbye to any part of the world, which feels really satisfying.
Right.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So this kind of, I suppose, embodied thinking.
Yeah.
We like it because it can help produce feelings of scientific awe. Does it help give you counterfactual scientific insights?
It has for me, but I think I've become a lot more uncertain about how much in general it would do this. Like actually one thing that it was very helpful with is thinking about cryopreservation, which is the topic I work on now with my co-founder at Cradle. And initially, it was just helpful in doing thought experiments. Like initially it was like, I didn't have a good way to think about cryo, but seeing that if you just look inside a cell, like you just see a bunch of like molecules just bumping about, and that basically there's this really weird thing about cryo, which I've tried. I'm writing a piece right now just trying to express some of this, but it's like it's incredibly strange that you can cryopreserve and rewarm anything. Because if you think about it, let's say that you took like a really complicated factory, right? And you stopped everyone in their tracks in the factory. And so they stopped moving. And then you spun them around and had them walk in a completely random direction. And then had them like, go back to their normal walking speed. But like everyone was walking random directions. Like that's what cryopreservation is. It basically, when the way that it works, and I'm not sure if it'll make sense to explain, but like it kind of just like randomizes the molecular motion of all the molecules after you go to zero, like if you go to like very low temperatures, which is super weird, right? And almost everything that we build at the human scale is incompatible with that kind of, or it's like we just don't have to. We don't really have systems that are invariant to that kind of randomization, but cells are for some reason. And this was immediately obvious, or like I think it was pretty easy for me to guess why that might be quickly personally. And I'm sure this has been described elsewhere in literature, but just like because I'd already been doing a lot of thought experiments and the cell, it's very clear when you do that, just like the cells run on passive diffusion and how strange that is. Like the cells run on molecules bouncing about in random directions. Like everything in it is oriented around, or like, and there's some phases, but like, it's just like, I don't know if I'm doing justice to the concept, but like, unlike a computer where you have, like sort of, you kind of know that if you start current off here, then it might go here, or like, there's some, in a cell, it's like you just have this bag of molecules that's being shaken all the time. And like, that's how it runs. Like, and nothing is guaranteed to be in a particular place unless it's like very bonded to be in that place. And so that's just so different from how we design objects ordinarily that then when you think about things from that perspective, it makes a lot more sense why cryopreservation is even possible. But if I hadn't spent so much time hanging out in the cell, or this was obviously pretty early on, that I think I wouldn't have really have internalized how much passive diffusion, how weird it is that the cells just run on passive diffusion. Does that make sense?
I think so. And so for context for people, here we would be cooling, for example, like resected brain tissue to minus 130 degrees Celsius, thereabouts.
And below, yeah.
And below, yeah. Past that threshold. I mean, it's funny, one of my questions was going to be, do you have any toy models for thinking about cryopreservation? So this is clearly an example.
Yeah, and it's complicated because, like, you could argue that, well, because we empirically know that you can cryopreserve things, like what good is this toy model? But just, I know I do feel like I understand cryopreservation better for seeing the link between this property and the fact that cells evolve to run with very high amounts of thermal noise, and therefore, like, they have all these properties that make them so good at being invariant to this like randomization that we induce with cryopreservation. And how strange it would be that we would think that would be true for any other system,
Right. One other question on embodied thinking. So do you think certain types of science or certain fields of science are more amenable to that mode of thinking than others?
I think so. Although I don't really know. Like, biology to me feels so natural for that. Like, it feels so natural to like imagine yourself in a cell as like a starting point. I think physics also feels very natural. I'm starting to understand this tiniest amount of mathematics the past couple of years, and I think that feels just like super different. Like, it's not like to me, mathematics, the little that I like think about feels much more like a totally foreign object than it does like I'm just embodied person using my normal world simulation, but in a different scale of world or a world with different rules. It feels like I'm just dealing with objects that are so different from my normal experience that I just have to kind of assume that they're different latent space and kind of go with that. So it's a similar level of maybe immersion, but at least personally, it feels super different in terms of like how much you can use your 3D everyday intuitions from walking around in the world.
Right. One of the other themes that stands out to me about your career is mentorship. And I had some questions about scientific mentorship because you've both been both a mentee and a mentor. You began volunteering in Cynthia Kenyon's lab when you were 12. I'm curious because obviously you were a very precocious 12-year-old, but being able to receive and interpret tacit knowledge in a scientific lab requires like a ton of context. So I'm curious how you would describe the most important things you learned in Cynthia's lab.
I haven't thought about that really, in particular in a long time. So it's interesting. I'm not really sure. I mean, Cynthia's, to be clear, like an extraordinary person, and she's extraordinary she's like one of the most extraordinary mentors I think I've ever met, in that she has this bravery where she believes in ideas before everyone else, just because she thinks they're right. And it's not from any kind of motivated reasoning thing. I think it's just like she just really was at the time was like developmental biology controls, certain processes. Why not also this process? I don't know if you know, but she was, I think if I remember, the lead author, or at least like did a lot of the work herself on the seminal paper from her lab, because no one in her lab, or maybe it was a rotation student in her lab, was took on the project, but that nobody else in her lab would take on this risky project that she was so excited about.
Was this the age one paper for C. elegans?
This was the DAF2 paper, which is
the DAF2 paper.
Yeah. Related mutation that yeah. And so she's amazing, but also I mean, she's just an incredible mentor, especially to, I think, unconventional people, like in the sense like I was not the only person who was like off the beaten track that she took into her lab, and I think she just I think the same things that make her incredible with ideas, where she just can see what's there, and that just kind of is the thing that's important to her. She did, I forget if it was weekly meetings, but like she would meet with me and treat me as seriously as a grad student in terms of like her attention and care towards my intellectual development and explaining things to me, giving me projects that were extremely advanced in retrospect for what I could have been seen to like old. I think I just felt extremely seen by her as somebody who just took me seriously intellectually, even though I was like 12 years old, you know? And in retrospect, like, I don't know if I would have the capacity to be as gracious and thoughtful about it as she was at that time. Like, I really think, in retrospect, it really moves me when I think about it because I think she's so special. And I just didn't understand at the time how special that was for her to do.
Yeah, I wonder whether maybe the most important thing you learned in her lab was how to be a scientific mentor.
Maybe that, or I think also just like the self confidence of being taken seriously by somebody that I thought was like the most amazing person in the world. Like, you know, I think that's probably also was scientifically, like I think there's just a lot of stuff where I now have a lot of memories of like looking at glowing worms under microscopes and trying to like ablate their gonads that are kind of funny, and you know, like was just kind of funny time. And that, yeah, but yeah.
Yeah. So if we think of mentorship as a talent search problem, does it differ in any unique ways from other talent search problems like finding a co-founder or finding employees or investing in founders as a venture capitalist?
Um, so I think mentorship is like so beautiful, and it might be the case that training tribe explicitly destroys any actual insight or any actual kind of stuff there.
Right.
Um, but I think for me, what feels really important is to try to be a mentor to people where you feel very strongly that they have something beautiful inside them that you can see. Like it might be the case that everyone has something very beautiful inside them, but it might be the case that I'm only best able to see that in a certain like kind of person who might like similar things to what I like, or just like has some like I think for me I really respond to like what feels like authenticity and deep care and love for ideas like that. When I meet somebody who has that, I think like I feel very interested in them being able to express that well in the world, and I feel able to think through what might help do that well sometimes. Um, so that feels really interesting to me. Yeah.
Mm. Beyond Cynthia, is there any kind of mentorship you wish that you'd had or that you could have right now?
Oh yeah, enormously. um, yeah, uh, I think Silicon Valley is a very industry town, and I came here when I was very young, and I didn't appreciate how much that I think quashed a lot of creativity that I had for a long time. And I would have really appreciated, I think, somebody who could have given me the affirmation that I needed when I was younger, that it's good to be creative, it's good to be loving, it's good to be intuitive. I think I really, as you just get trained when you come here to overfit to these very specific patterns of being that are just so, and they really destroy a lot of originality, I think, and a lot of like very, very interesting stuff that is at the heart of doing new things.
Right.
Yeah.
What's an example of a Silicon Valley pattern that destroys creativity?
I mean, if you're pushed to fundraise from an early age, I think you're very aggressively trained to. It's kind of like sales. Like you have to very quickly make an argument for your competence and your trustworthiness and your knowledge, like very quickly, and then you have to kind of hold. This is what I used to think. I think I feel this way less now, but and because you're young, like you don't know anything, and so it's like you're trying to. I think it almost feels like you're trying to both be honest with who you are, but then also trying to pretend to have this competence and this like confidence that, you know, when you're 17 and you just come here and like I think when I was younger, I did feel very confident, but in retrospect, it was kind of just like me hyping myself up internally. It wasn't, I think now I'm like, when I have an idea that I'm really passionate about, I feel confident at the core of my being from the idea itself. It feels like this idea is just correct. I don't care what anyone else says. I mean, maybe it's incorrect and I'll find that out later, but just like, I kind of have this deep sense of like, yeah, this is right. I think when I was younger, it was like, I'm going to make this happen. And because I have to, you know, it was kind of more where a lot of the confidence was coming from. And that feels different to me.
I see.
Yeah.
When you're mentoring someone, how do you think about the right balance between actively helping them versus kind of just like letting them figure it out themselves?
Mm. I think for me personally, it's almost never actively helping someone. Although I do have friends, or like, I've been thinking more recently about like maybe you should push yourself or people sometimes, but it's like this extremely like it's like I think you just see the beauty in someone and you're like, this is extremely beautiful, and how like what from the outside could help that beauty grow or something.
Mm.
Yeah, that's how I think about it.
Okay, some questions about longevity and cryopreservation to finish with. So there's this book by Morton Myers called Happy Accidents about serendipity and drug development. And if I remember correctly, and this was true at least at the time the book was written, I think this the fact was of all of the drugs on the market, only about 50 of them were being used for what they were originally designed for. How should longevity science grapple with this problem of serendipity, given that if things if there's a drug that could have an effect on all cause aging, presumably it would need a long time to reveal its benefits. So, how do you grapple with serendipity in drug development in longevity science?
Those feel like a little bit distinct to me, like the difficulty of running longevity trial. Like I would say like uh, to my current understanding, which again, like the field is now in a place where I want to be careful and respectful. Like there might be something that like might be incorrect on, but like there just isn't a good way to get around running very large, very difficult, in many cases very expensive trials for the first longevity drugs. Like that is just kind of locked in to actually, talk about lifespan extension and showing that there might be a world in the future where we have better proxies for aging and for longevity that we can use to more quickly do trials to better biomarkers. But I think we're not to the point where those are sufficient to imply longevity.
I see. I'm curious to get your current takes on aging. Is it mostly the result of sort of noise and randomness, or is it more the result of like programmed or quasi-programmed patterns? Or I guess like which theory of aging do you kind of favor at the moment?
I mean, I think that it's a extremely strange but true fact that like there are single genes that we can change in many organisms that just change lifespan. Like it's sometimes in the positive, and sometimes in very small organisms to like an insane multiple. And that we really don't know how much those genetic changes, like how far we can push them and how much they translate to humans. We don't know how much they translate to humans, to be clear. Like I think we don't know the causality of how much changing single gene, changing very simple things that we're good at changing in drug development in humans could lead to lifespan extension yet. But it's just really weird that it could be programmed at all. Like it's incredibly strange. I think the default assumption is that it's mostly just a system breaking down over time in a way that's not very simply programmed. But there seems to be just some non-zero component that is that you can control, at least again in a lot of non-human organisms, and potentially also in humans there might be some things that we could change. It's just yeah, it's really strange that that's true.
Say a bit more about why it's so strange.
Uh, I think it's like similar to cryopreservation, where like I just always I might be unique in this regard, but like I start off usually feeling very skeptical of things in biology because we're like trillions of we're like 10 to the 27 to 10 to the 28 atoms arranged in this like incredibly complex fashion. We're very robust in some ways, but we're not made to be robust. A lot of the changes that we're considering making. I think to some degree we've evolved to like have modularity, but I think just like the more I look at biology and biological systems and see the number of atoms that are interacting in these like really complex ways, the more it's surprising to me when we can make very simple changes and have the whole system kind of change. And again, there are some physiological systems that I think it makes sense that they be evolved to be simply regulated. But for stuff that's not necessarily as evolved, like yeah, I just think your prior should be that like that's not likely to be plausible or something.
And to give people context here, so the interventions that we can make on the worm C. elegans can increase its lifespan by about 50%.
You can go up to 2x. I think that they're if I remember correctly, at this point, it's been a while, but might be sixfold. There might have been higher lifespans reported, although I'd want to go back and just double check to see if someone's replicated that stuff at this point because it's been a while now. But yeah, you can just like do insane like amounts of lifespan extension in things like worms. In mice, it's more like, let's say like 60%, maybe a little bit higher, depending on what you want to define as like intervention, but still quite substantial. I think the argument with mice is often that like maybe these mice are like sick or maybe they're not representative of like the most healthy human population. But even in that case, it's surprising that you can change one thing and have them live differently. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so say you're appointed FDA commissioner tomorrow.
Yeah.
What are some of the first things you're doing to reduce regulatory bottlenecks to longevity drugs?
I think I would like make it like lay the groundwork for aging as an indication. Like, or like I think there's a lot of regulatory work to be done to like conceptualize what it could mean for a longevity drug, to exist for that indication. So I'd put that in place. But honestly, the most important thing would be I would just like I would find some way to shorten timelines for review cycles while still being effective and thoughtful from let's say 6 months to like ideally a couple of weeks. Although, I don't know if that's actually plausible for the FDA. I want the FDA to do, what it had to do to be safe and effective. But I think that the 6-month review cycles for preclinical companies are can be very like it's basically just like you every time you want to make a change, you have another 6 months of iteration of waiting and just kind of like you submitted something and you're not really sure. And there's some parts of the FDA that are amazing and very collaborative and very helpful and will give you a lot of feedback so that this process works well. But I think just like that uncertainty, again, I might be that's required for some kind of internal process, but just like that is, I think, such a huge contributor to timeline uncertainty for companies. So anything that would help the FDA shorten those processes by functioning more quickly in some way like that, that's very helpful for companies.
Right. So the Longevity Fund closed its first fund in 2013, and several of its portfolio companies have now IPO'd, like Unity Bio. I'm curious whether, so now that you've started to see some of the results of the investments, whether you've noticed any patterns among the founders or companies that have been most successful.
Yeah, I mean, we started out investing in a lot of companies that I think we're all kind of all over the place in terms of stage. And especially in the first fund, I think there's a huge focus on just doing things that felt very conservative in terms of like they looked like normal biotech companies, but there was some way in which they were quite linked to aging if you were looked at the biology. That felt important just to kind of like give the field examples of companies that we felt like biotech understood, but that also were longevity. Over time, though, it's just become really clear, like the most important thing for us is they're very founder-oriented companies going after actual moonshot ideas that we're interacting with from the earliest stages. Like if you look at every company in our portfolio that's like done like very well, they like kind of have those characteristics. I think it's just because like that's what we understand best. Yeah.
This episode is sponsored by Vanta. Trust isn't just earned, it's demanded. Whether you're a startup founder navigating your first audit or a seasoned security professional scaling your GRC program, proving your commitment to security has never been more critical or more complex. That's where Vanta comes in. Businesses use Vanta to establish trust by automating compliance needs over 35 frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO 27001, centralized security workflows, complete questionnaires up to 5 times faster, and proactively manage vendor risk. I have personal experience here. Startups I've worked at have used Vanta, and I've always found it reliable. Vanta can help you start or scale your security program by connecting you with auditors and experts to conduct your audit and set up your security program quickly. Plus, with automation and AI throughout the platform, Vanta gives you time back so you can focus on building your company. Join over 9,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, and FireAnt who use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. For a limited time, get $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/Joe. That's VANTA.com/JOE for $1,000 off. So before we were recording, we were talking about evolution, and you've been like self-teaching or studying evolution for like a few years now. I'm curious, what surprised you most about the field of evolution?
I don't know. I mean, I think like I'm pretty naive about this stuff. Like, I definitely don't understand evolution, like I almost at all. But I think one thing that's been really interesting is just that evolution and natural selection are two different things. Like natural selection is the combination, like we are talking about, of replication, variation, and like selection. And evolution, I think, is just the idea that things kind of change over time in some continuous way, and just the observation that that's true. So I might like know that there's this like species fossil record, but that doesn't tell me why that's true. And so like you can use natural selection as an explanation for evolution. I think the only thing I understand now is just that like evolution is almost never used in a way that to me feels like under the person who's using the term understands it, or that the using the term contributes to um like using the term is actually helpful, if that makes sense. So often it's just used to mean like change, or that like things are the way, like people will often say like we evolved to be this way. It's like to the extent that they're invoking an idea of natural selection in that statement, it's often unclear what's the basis on which they're invoking that claim. It's like if we evolved everything in our current life because of natural selection, like that doesn't actually add, that doesn't necessarily, it's also not just not true that everything that we see around us is, selected for. Like many things might just like be neutrally, like just take over population, like from a perspective of like neutral drift. And so it's just, I think it's really, I just get really bothered a lot, honestly, now by like the phrase evolution being used and then just like not really being used in a way that's helpful at all. So the problem though is like there are other ways that population can evolve. Like you can have one mutation take over full population, but not be fitness giving. Just like if you have random walk, then you can have like a mutation completely 100% take over population just through random walk.
Right.
And that actually might happen a lot. I think we currently think that it does happen like a similar amount of the time.
Yeah.
And so, a large fraction of the population got here, changed over time in a way that looks like it was selected for, but wasn't, maybe.
Right.
And so then you have to really defend, okay, if I'm talking about natural selection specifically, what's the evidence for that having been the mechanism? And it's like, well, how do you actually prove that, which I think is an interesting challenge. Like, I think natural selection definitely happens, but it's like, how do you know when it happens? How do you justify when you use that as like, and what does it tell you if it happened about what's there today? Yeah.
And presumably your interest in evolution was motivated by ultimate explanations for aging?
Not at all. No.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Just pure
Totally
intellectual
unrelated.
curiosity or something else?
I was really obsessed when I was a kid. I was like, I want to like figure out what Newton's laws are, but for biology. And after thinking about this for a while, I became like convinced that like laws around how populations learn to coordinate were kind of like I don't know if they're actually missing from evolution, but they're just kind of like the thing to focus on in communication populations. And so there's like I had to understand evolution to understand that concept, and then just like got really, really confused about evolution. I'm still confused about evolution.
Me too, but we should continue trying to work it out. So, okay, some questions on cryopreservation to finish. Firstly, so through the longevity fund, you would have obtained a nice broad view of the field of longevity. I'm curious of like all of the different things you saw and all of the different emerging technologies, why you chose cryopreservation as the thing for you personally to work on.
so obvious. Like, it's so obvious. Like, I can't tell you how, to me, when I think about, like, the problem of cryopreservation, I feel like a mathematician who spent their whole life, like, trying to find the perfect mathematical problem, and one day you just, like, find this thing and you're like, "Oh my god," it has all the properties. Like, cryopreservation is it's so intensely fascinating. I often talk about it like it has, if you wanna, let's say you wanna pick a problem to spend your life on. Things that I care about that I think are not unique to me are I wanna pick a problem that's, like, very impactful, a problem that is, technically tractable. You can work on it and make progress. We might not be guaranteed success, but like you have a fair shot, and that almost no one else is working on seriously. To be clear, I mean that like there's a lot of cryopreservation work in academia. I think there's just a very low number of companies working on it from a company perspective, as there could be. And cryopreservation is just the best answer to this question I've ever found. Like, if you fully solve medical hibernation, then, plausibly any terminal illness that is worrying you or hurting someone you love, you could potentially imagine using cryopreservation as a way. And when I say cryopreservation, what I'm referring to is reversible cryopreservation. So let's say I had the perfect device. I think about it often like a one-way time machine. Like, let's say I can put you in a box, and then in 1 to 2 years, you can get out of the box and kind of walk around as your normal self. And if you have a terminal illness for which, I know somebody, my co-founder knows someone who, got stage 4 metastatic cancers, and in my case, the person lived, in my co-founder's case, the person died. They were both about, let's say, like half a year away from. In my case, the person made it to the trial or to the drug coming out that saved their life. And for my co-founder, they were, like, let's say even months away from when they would have been eligible for that drug. And if you just had something to bridge the gap to therapies that we know are going to come out that would save your life, we're not talking even about like living infinite amounts of time. It could just be a normal lifespan, but it's like just getting you the best access to medicine that might be like very, very close to where you are. That feels just so urgent and important and so leveraged, right? Like, often in medicine, it's like you want to solve every problem, and yet you're focused on solving one problem. To be clear, medicine needs to continue for cryopreservation to be at all relevant. So it's not arguing for not working on medicine, but like if you solve this one problem completely, you then get access to like all these other things in the future. And so it's so leveraged. And then technically, it's certainly an extremely difficult problem, and there's worlds in which it's not solvable, but it's able to, it's somewhat like neurotech in the sense that it allows you to use engineering and physics to interface with a problem in a way that's just so deep and so not true of almost any other problem in biology. Like, it so intimately allows you to use these technologies to quickly develop like new solutions and use the full palette or like the full spectrum of ideas in physics to attack the problem. Yeah, and then lastly, almost it's compared to all those things, it's not worked on. I think mostly because it's just too weird. Like, there's some ideas that are just too weird, and it's something that I believe so much now that when I started my career, I was like, there's no way it's true. It's like my friends used to say like, it's just more true than you would think that like the markets are inefficient, but just like I think because cryo is so weird, it's not worked on, and it's that and there's also actually a bunch of other reasons, but like there's a lot of baggage around it that makes it an idea that has like a force field around it. It's kind of like an ick force field, but then once you're inside it, you're like, this is so beautiful and so impactful, and like it's so underworked on for what it could be, I think.
Right. So perhaps this isn't a useful way to carve up the space here, but if we think about the 4 different categories of aging interventions, so restoring, replacing, delaying, and then pausing, obviously cryopreservation fits into that last category of pausing. Is that category somehow inherently more tractable than the other 3 categories?
To me, it and I'm like, I've written a whole post on this that I'll post at some point, but like it has a number of characteristics that as a single problem, like I think if you want to solve all of longevity or all of cryopreservation, like I think the latter will be a more straightforward problem just because it's more fully defined.
Mm-hmm.
And it has more places to plug in tools from physics and engineering in ways that give you a lot of leverage to solve the problem. So cryo definitely feels to me a lot more tractable as one problem. Now, a lot of people should still work on all of longevity. But I'm just saying, if you want a particular single problem to work on, it feels really, really perfect, or it feels like it has a lot of amazing characteristics. Yeah.
So you mentioned there's sort of like a somewhat of a taboo around cryopreservation. So I assume it's fair to say that public communication is like more difficult for cryopreservation specifically than it is for the field of longevity in general.
Um, it's incredibly complicated. Like, or actually, I'm avoiding. I think it's like very anti-memetic. Like, there are things that I can't talk about publicly that I think are like just such amazing reasons why it's underworked on.
Uh-huh.
But you like because like they're part of the power of them being good at shielding the field is that if you talk about them publicly, then it leads to these other things that like you might personally want to. Yeah, it's just very interesting reasons why it's so anti-memetic. I think that's changing. I think a lot of the reasons why that was true are now changing, but it's like incredibly well crafted to not be noticed, I think.
Okay. Is there anything more you can say here that you can share publicly? I'm just really interested in this.
Yeah, maybe in a couple years, but right now, it's not. Yeah, not really.
Okay.
What I can say is like, in addition to the stuff that like I'm gesturing to, there's also just a lot of things where it's like I think cold things that like cold people don't like being freezing or very cold. This is actually a huge deal. Like there's a lot of like intuition of not liking the idea of cryopreservation. That's I think adds in another level of veneer. But yeah, there's just a lot of stuff that. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So it runs counter to a lot of intuitions.
Runs counter to a lot of intuitions, and yeah.
Yep. Okay. Watch this space. Well, it's been lovely to talk with you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks. You had so many